There are these giant stone heads in Mexico with what a lot of people say have African features. DNA studies showing African genetic markers in indigenous Mexican populations that are thousands of years old, not from the slave trade, but ancient. And also Egyptian mummies with cocaine in their systems, and cocaine only grew in the Americas. So either all of this evidence is fake, or ancient people were way more connected than we've been told. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero. Thank you so much for being with me here on my channel where we talk about American identity and family stories. I'm excited to dive into some mysteries around identity, American identity with you. But first, if you would like to connect with me off of YouTube, come join me over at patreon.com. All right, so let's start with the guy who kicked off this whole mess. Professor Greg Wiggin from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. In 2018, so this is not that long ago, Wiggin sued UNC. He claimed they denied him a promotion to full professorship because he was black. He said it was racial discrimination. The case went to court. He lost. But 2 years later, in June 2020, Wiggin published a paper in a journal called the Urban Review. The paper was titled, Early Pioneers of the Americas, the Role of the Olmecs in Urban Education and Social Studies Curriculum. This was a lesson plan that was arguing that schools should teach kids that the Olmecs, the ancient Mexican civilization that dates back to 1500 years before Christ, were actually black Africans who crossed the Atlantic and established one of the first major civilizations in the Americas. Well, within months, the journal had retracted that paper. The journal said this: the theory that the Olmecs were black Africans is not substantiated according to the current Mesoamerican archaeology and genetic evidence. Translation here, this was wrong, we shouldn't have published it. But here's where it gets interesting. Wiggin and his co-authors refused to accept the retraction. And they said, well, we stand by our work. And that's when it exploded into this massive controversy. So indigenous scholars came out swinging, and they said that the Black Olmec theory erases indigenous achievement, and that it was racist to claim that Native Americans couldn't have built their own civilization, and that it was Africans instead. But supporters of Wiggin said that academia has always suppressed evidence of black African achievement, and that this is just more Eurocentric gatekeeping. So who's right? So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you the evidence that people like Wiggin point to, and I'm going to show you why skeptics say it's wrong. And then I'm going to show you the parts that I don't think really add up on either side, because this isn't about proving Wiggin right or wrong. This is about asking, why does this question make people so angry? And what are we not being told? So let's start with the most famous piece of evidence themselves, the Olmec heads. Okay, if you've never seen the Olmec heads, you've got to see them. They're incredible. They're impressive. They're these massive stone sculptures. Some of them weigh up to 50 tons. That's like almost 100,000 pounds. They were carved from single blocks of basalt rock. They estimate like maybe 3,000 years ago in what's now Veracruz, Mexico. So far there are 17 of these heads, and they all depict human heads wearing what looks like helmets or headgear of some kind. And the detailing is really extraordinary. The individual facial features, expressions, even what you might see like headbands or braided hair, things like that. Now here's what started this whole controversy. A lot of people look at those heads and say, those look African. So I'm going to describe what people point to, and you can decide for yourself. So the heads have broad noses and full lips, and certain facial proportions, maybe wider faces, specific jawlines. Some of them do have what appears to be tightly curled or braided hair, and the overall features, to a lot of observers, they say these are stereotypically African more than indigenous. So the question is, are they seeing something real, or are they projecting what they want to see? Because here's the counter-argument. A lot of these same features still appear in modern indigenous people from that region. Broad noses and full lips are not exclusively African features, right? And if you go to Veracruz today, you will see people who look a lot like those heads. So the heads alone, I would say these are ambiguous. You can interpret them either way. Let me tell you something weird about these heads that does not get talked about. The basalt rock that they're carving from, it doesn't exist anywhere near where the heads are found. And these weren't just carved, they were transported over 60 miles over mountains through the jungles 3,000 years ago. So we're talking about moving 50-ton boulders 60 miles without wheels, without metal tools. The Olmecs did not have horses or oxen. So the question isn't, could indigenous people have done this? Obviously they could. the evidence is right there. But the question is, were they doing it alone? Or were there outside influences? So here's another thing that's weird about this story. The Olmecs had one of the earliest writing systems in the Americas. So we found inscriptions on stone monuments that date back to 900 BC, and the script is still mostly undeciphered, but it's clearly a sophisticated writing system. So some researchers have claimed that the Olmec symbols look similar to ancient African scripts, particularly from West Africa, like ancient Libyan scripts. Mainstream archaeology says these are coincidental similarities, that humans independently develop similar symbols all over the world. Okay, so the heads are ambiguous. The symbols might be a coincidence. But what about the DNA? Because this is where things get really hard to explain away. All right, so let's talk about genetics. Scientists can look at genetic markers, specific patterns in your DNA, and trace them back thousands of years. Okay, so different populations have different markers. European markers, we're going to look different than African markers, which look different from Native American markers. So when geneticists are studying the indigenous population, they're expecting to find Native American markers, right? But here's what they found in some indigenous Mexican populations. African genetic markers that are old. We're not talking like slave trade, DNA, or colonial period. We're talking about like genetic signatures that suggest contact thousands of years ago. Specifically, there's a haplogroup, a genetic lineage called haplogroup A, and I've talked a little bit about haplogroups on this channel and shared mine with you. So this is a common haplogroup in Africa, and it shows up in some indigenous populations in Mexico at frequencies that are kind of hard to explain. So the mainstream explanation is this, that either, one, it's contamination from more recent African ancestry that's being misdated. Two, it could be an ancient marker that actually came across the Bering Strait in Asia, since humans all originally came from Africa anyway. Or three, it's just statistical noise in the data. So these are the possible mainstream explanations for this haplogroup. So let's talk about something even weirder. And this is where we move beyond just the Olmecs into this broader evidence of maybe transatlantic contact. In 1992, a German scientist named Svetlana Belavanova was analyzing ancient Egyptian mummies. She was testing the remains for various substances to learn about ancient life. And she found cocaine, nicotine, in multiple mummies dating back 3,000 years ago. Now here's the problem. Cocaine comes from cocoa plants, which only grew in South America, and nicotine comes from tobacco, which also only grew in the Americas. So these plants did not exist in Africa or Europe until after Columbus. So how did ancient Egyptians have cocaine and tobacco in their systems 3,000 years ago? When she published her findings, the archaeology establishment went nuclear on her. They said her results were impossible, that the mummies had been contaminated, or the tests were wrong, or she made it up. But she wasn't some fringe researcher. She was a forensic toxicologist with decades of experience, and so she stood by her results. So the labs tested other mummies. Guess what? They found the same thing. Cocaine, nicotine, in mummies that were thousands of years old. Now, the explanations offered for this were, one, modern contamination, but how? Multiple mummies, multiple labs, same results. Two, that ancient plants produce similar compounds that existed in Africa, but we haven't found them yet, which I guess is possible, but we've never found evidence of those plants existing. Or three, there was a transatlantic trade, which could rewrite everything we know about ancient history. Well, you can guess what numbers the mainstream archaeology went with, explanation 1 and 2. And I said, we'll figure it out eventually. Let's move on. Nothing to see here. But they haven't figured it out. And the cocaine is still there, and the nicotine is still there, and nobody has a good explanation. And it's not just cocaine. There's a lot more. Thor Heyerdahl was a Norwegian explorer who in 1970 built a boat out of papyrus reeds, the same material that the ancient Egyptians used, and he sailed it across the Atlantic from Morocco to Barbados. His trip took 57 days. The boat survived, and he proved that ancient people could have crossed the Atlantic using period-appropriate technology. Now, mainstream archaeology says, sure, it's possible, but there's no evidence that they did it. So, it's possible, but they didn't do it, so it doesn't matter. But here's what I find interesting. Heyerdahl has been described in some declassified documents as having connections to the CIA. Why would the CIA care about ancient transatlantic contact theories? What's the strategic interest even controlling this narrative? I don't know. It's weird. It's like outside my pay grade, which is 0. So here's another one. In the Andes Mountains, on a lake between Bolivia and Peru, indigenous boat builders still make reed boats, like reeds, using these ancient techniques. And the boats look almost identical to the ancient Egyptian reed boats, like same design, same construction methods, same materials. Coincidence? Maybe, right? Humans independently invent similar technologies all the time. Maybe not. Maybe there was contact. Maybe there was knowledge spread. We don't know, but the similarity is striking. So here's what we got. We have Olmec heads that might look African, cocaine in Egyptian mummies, DNA anomalies that are hard to explain, proof that the ancient transatlantic travel was possible, and unexplained technological similarities. Now, does all of this prove ancient Africans or Phoenicians or Egyptians came to America? No. When there's a lot of smoke, there's usually a fire. So why is even investigating this so dangerous? So when the Wigan paper came out in 2020, some of the loudest opposition came from indigenous scholars, and their argument, I think, is really powerful. They were saying that, claiming that the Olmecs were Africans erases their history. And you know what? I understand that point, because throughout history, when indigenous people built something impressive, let's say pyramids, stone cities, complex astronomical systems, Europeans would sometimes point out they couldn't have done this. It must have been ancient aliens or Atlantis or Egyptian, like anyone else, right? Anyone else. And so I think that's a fair criticism. I think it needs to be taken seriously. But then there's the other side, where Afrocentric scholars and researchers say, Western academia has always downplayed or erased African achievement. And so finding evidence of the possibility that Africans might have accomplished these feats, like crossing the Atlantic 3,000 years ago, gets dismissed as impossible or fringe or whatever. I think that's also an interesting point. So here's the problem. Both sides are responding to real historical injuries and injustices. And I think that makes having an honest conversation about the evidence really difficult. But here's what I keep coming back to. Why can't we at least talk about the investigation, the evidence, without becoming a war? Why can't we say indigenous Americans built incredible civilizations, full stop? That's not up for debate. And also there was contact with other cultures. Maybe there was trade, exchange, or even a few explorers who came, visited, and left. Why does it have to be either or, right? Why can't it be both? The Vikings reached America around 1000 AD. We know this. I'm going to do a video on this. There's archaeological evidence. There's genetic evidence, like a Native American woman in Iceland, that I'm going to be talking about. And why are we suggesting that maybe other transatlantic contact is treated differently? Here's what really bothers me. It feels like there is this institutional resistance. If the evidence is so obviously wrong, why not let's just study it and prove that it's wrong? So let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Because I think what's happening here is more complex than just is this evidence real or is it fake? History isn't just about facts. It's about identity, about who we are, where we come from, where we're going. And whoever controls the narrative about the past controls something important in our present. I'm saying that this is a political reality, and that political reality makes honest investigation really difficult sometimes. But here's what concerns me the most. I think we're reaching a point, or we have reached a point, at least in America, where certain questions can't be asked, not because they've been thoroughly investigated and answered, but because asking them is politically or socially dangerous. And that's not science, that is ideology. So look, maybe the Olmecs were 100% indigenous American with no outside contact. That is entirely possible. Follow the evidence where it leads us. And then there's the weird CIA connection with Thor Heyerdahl. Why would intelligence agencies care about ancient contact theories? Here's one possibility. If you can control the narrative about the past, you can influence the present. That matters for land, that matters for resources, political power. And I'm not saying that there is a massive conspiracy out there, but what I am saying is that governments and institutions, they do have a vested interest in controlling historical narratives. And that makes me wonder, what else are we not being told? So I've shown you some evidence, shown you both sides of this controversy, and why I think this gets so complicated. Now I want you to tell me what you think. I think ancient people are more connected, and they were more connected than we've been told. I think there was probably transatlantic contact that happened occasionally, not like a massive colonization or sustained trade routes, but occasional voyages. People maybe get blown off course, and maybe when they arrived, they encountered these advanced indigenous civilizations that had been thriving for thousands of years. Maybe there was exchange, ideas, technology, maybe even people integrated into these societies. You know, kind of like what happens now. I don't think this is either or. I think it's both and. Here's why I think it matters for us here. If ancient people were more connected than we thought, what does that mean for your own ancestry, for your own history? How many of us have done DNA tests and found unexpected results, or ancestry from places that our family never talked about, made no sense? We're like, this is crazy, this can't be real. History is messier than the textbooks make it seem. Populations mixed. People traveled farther than we thought. Identities are more fluid than we thought. Your ancestors left traces in your DNA in archaeological sites and stories that were written down and stories that were meant to be forgotten. And I think maybe some of those traces suggest connections we don't understand yet. The Olmec heads are still there. The DNA anomalies are still unexplained, and there's still cocaine in those mummies. The evidence is still there. History is bigger and more strange and more connected than we've been told. And maybe it's time we start asking the questions we're not supposed to ask. So if this video made you think differently about our history, please hit the subscribe button, because I want to keep digging into some of these mysteries that we aren't supposed to investigate. Your ancestors left messages in stone, in DNA, and artifacts that are still buried in the ground. What are they trying to tell us?